Scud Race was an arcade racing game released by Sega in 1996 that ushered in a new era of incredible 3D graphics in the arcade at a time when 3D polygon titles were still in their relative infancy. It's also a game that I developed a bit of an obsession over in the mid to late 2000s as an unconverted piece of Sega history that Sega themselves seemed content to just forget about. And I encountered a Scud Race cabinet recently in a retro arcade for the first time in about probably 20 odd years, which is what prompted me to do this retro review. So let's have a look at this classic racer in a bit more detail, and the infatuation that I had with it for quite a long time, despite only really ever playing it a few times in the arcade. The early to mid 1990s was a real turning point in arcade hardware and graphics, as games began the leap from 2D sprite-based graphics to fully 3D polygon titles, with Sega very much leading the early charge, with games like Virtua Racing and Virtua Fighter showing how flat-shaded polygon games running on their Model 1 arcade board could actually create engaging, deep, fast and most importantly fun arcade experiences. The Model 1 board debuted in 1992, and Sega's next generation hardware, the Model 2, followed 2 years after that. Rolling Star! It was the first Sega arcade board to produce texture-mapped 3D polygon graphics, capable of 300,000 polygons per second, versus the Model 1 board's 180,000. The addition of the textures to the polygons added a huge layer of additional realism to the graphics, and made them look less like something from a Dire Straits video. The follow-on to this, the Model 3 board, that Sega co-developed with Lockheed Martin, in comparison could do 2 million textured polygons a second, with additional effects like Gorad shading, translucency, anti-aliasing, fog, lighting and Z buffering, whatever the fuck that is. And in terms of raw polygons, could move around 4 million triangles a second. Roughly translated, it was an incredible technological leap forward, and it looked absolutely amazing. And the game that debuted this new high-powered hardware in 1996 was Scud Race, also known as Sega Super GT in America, an arcade racer created by Sega AM2 based on the short-lived BPR Global GT Racing Series, with Toshihiro Nagoshi acting as lead developer. The addition of textures to the polygons in the Model 2 board games had felt like such a significant jump forward from the Model 1, but the graphics still had a slightly blocky, obviously polygon look about them, most notably in the tyres of the cars in Daytona. But the very first time I saw a Scud Race cabinet back in 1996, it genuinely looked like a game from the future. It just absolutely blew me away. Everything about it looked so much more realistic, fluid and dynamic compared to anything else that had come out before it, with the aforementioned features like the anti-aliasing, lighting and Gorad shading really adding to this newfound sense of realism. Things like the transparent windows on the car, the moving driver in the cockpit, the beautiful shiny gleaming bodywork of the cars, and the amazingly detailed backdrops surrounding the tracks. Each car in Scud Race was estimated to be made up of around 3,000 polygons each, 3 times the amount seen in the original Daytona USA, and it really showed in that level of detail. Those Sega blue skies had never looked so vibrant or amazing as they had here. The game didn't just boast spectacular looking visuals because of the realism they provided though. Scud Race was fast, like really fast, with those 60 frames per second polygons positively flying out of the screen at you. The races felt fast, intense and frenetic. All this newfangled visual jiggery-pokery was put to exceptionally good use in the game's first stage, which featured a drive-through aquarium with 2 transparent underwater sections, known as the Dolphin Tunnel. This was a particularly memorable location for a race to take place in, and the perfect way of showcasing this incredible new level of visual fidelity this next generation of Sega hardware was capable of. The other 3 of the game's 4 stages were also equally spectacular looking, with a race through a nighttime airport representing the game's other beginner stage, complete with jumbo jets flying overhead. And the advanced course Mystery Ruins, featuring a race through some waterfall strewn Aztec temples. The expert stage, Classic Castle, looked like it was set in a hilly European setting, with the player driving through and around a castle and colosseum. Much like Toshihiro Nagoshi and Sega AM2's Model 2 classic Daytona USA, Scud Race featured 40 CPU cars on the beginner stages, 30 on the advanced course and 20 on the expert track. In fact, many people actually considered Scud Race to be a spiritual successor to Daytona USA. Well, at least until that game got its own equally spectacular looking Model 3 sequel in 1998. As mentioned at the start of the video, Scud Race was based on a real-life racing event, the BPR Global GT Series, and featured 4 real-life cars from the series as the main playable vehicles: a Porsche 911 GT2, a Ferrari F40 GTE, a Dodge Viper GTSR, and the McLaren F1 GTR, the car which seems to have become most synonymous with the game. The Renault Alpine GTA A610S also featured as an unplayable CPU car. The game was also able to support a network of 8 players, although I only ever saw it in its twin 2-player sit-down form back in the day. There was also a Japan-only update to the game in 1997 called Scud Race Plus. As well as a new CGI intro, it added an extra track to the game called the Super Beginner Stage. This was an oval track in which the players are shrunk down to dinky car size and race across the toy-strewn floor of a house. There's also a cat and mouse that can be seen running around the track, and there's also the option to knock over some bowling pins each lap. The Super Beginner stage also let you select 4 secret vehicles to play as by holding down the start button on the car selection screen. A bus filled with Sega AM2 developers, a tank that could shoot rockets at the other cars, a cat, and a rocket car with a boost that you could use 3 times during the race. The secret vehicles were only playable on the Super Beginner stage, but when the game was eventually emulated, a member of the Supermodel forum figured out a way to hack them into the other stages, although this process does mess up the textures somewhat. Interestingly, the cat isn't affected by any kind of drift mechanics when you play as it, and it can just run full speed through a stage without any trouble at all. I only ever got to play Scud Race a few times in the arcade. I was a hard up student at the time, and at £1 a pop I normally had to limit the amount I spent to save on essentials such as food, beer, cigarettes and the occasional rave. Scud Race was such a graphical tour de force though. It really made a huge impact on me, despite never getting to play it a huge amount, or a chance to really get a feel for the gameplay back then. I owned a Sega Saturn at this time, and there were rumours that Scud Race was going to get ported to it, but that never actually happened. The Saturn, as you'd expect from a console that only cost a few £100, versus an arcade board that costs thousands, had to really cut back the visuals of its Model 2 ports. So if it had received a Scud Race conversion, a Model 3 game, it would have been severely graphically compromised. When I purchased a Sega Dreamcast in the year 2000 though, when I was actually working and a little bit more flush with cash, I was certain Scud Race would be converted to it, but to my absolute incredulity it never materialised, along with several other high profile Model 3 games like Daytona USA 2. I couldn't believe that this game, that had featured so prominently as a showcase for just how incredible Sega arcade games looked just a few years prior to this, didn't then lead the charge for Sega's newest console to show just how incredible games at home could look now too. Many years later, I found out that an early tech demo for the prototype Dreamcast hardware that was shown behind closed doors at Sega did actually feature elements from Scud Race to show what the hardware could do, including a recreation of the Beginner Day stage and the Dolphin Tunnel, and recreations of the Porsche and the Ferrari. So it is incredibly frustrating to think just how close we got to a Scud Race port. And just FYI, that Scud Race prototype Dreamcast tech demo is actually playable on PC now. I'll add a link to the video description that you can check out to find out more. There's been lots of speculation as to why the Dreamcast never got a full port of Scud Race. I myself made a video all about it many years ago, but it seems that the common consensus these days is that Sega wanted to avoid a reputation of only offering arcade ports to Dreamcast customers, and thus a full conversion was ruled out very early on, which sounds like a really daft decision to me. The main reason I bought a Dreamcast was to play perfect versions of their arcade games that were doing the rounds at this time. The same reason I'd bought a Sega Saturn before it, and a Mega Drive before that, and a Sega Master System before that. And those previous consoles had shown that excellent arcade ports could work in harmony with awesome original home titles. Anyway, I don't want to dwell too much on all the stupid decisions that Sega made around this time period, but suffice it to say, I was pretty bloody gutted that now that I finally had a console that could do a decent port of Scud Race, Sega were denying me it. I also mentioned in that other video that the arrival of games like Gran Turismo, real driving simulators and the like, had started to sound the death knell for the arcade racer genre as a whole to a certain extent. It's also worth just briefly mentioning here that when I've seen the topic of a Dreamcast Scud Race port brought up, in various forums and YouTube comments and the like, you usually get one genius who always goes,
Model 3 was way more powerful than Dreamcast. It couldn't have possibly handled a conversion.
to which I always want to reply to these bellends, do you not understand the concept of how a port works? Coders have been managing to squeeze thousands of pounds worth of arcade hardware into cartridges, cassettes, floppy disks and CD-ROMs for use on far less powerful home computers and consoles for years. Just look at the incredible job that Sega themselves did porting Sega Rally from the Model 2 board to the Sega Saturn. Plus, you only need to look at something like the Dreamcast port of San Francisco Rush 2049 or Daytona USA 2001 to see that the system would have been able to do a very technically capable 60 frames per second port of Scud Race. It might not have been 100% arcade perfect, but it probably would have been pretty damn close. Well, as long as they didn't bungle the visuals like they did with the Sega Rally 2 Dreamcast port. It's fair to say, in the intervening years before it was fully emulated at home, I had developed a bit of an obsession with Scud Race. In the late 2000s, arcade racing games were getting very scarce, and home ports of them were rarer still, a fact that frustrated me so much now that I actually had a console capable of doing them perfectly. That console being at this particular time my PS3. Seeing the odd few games that did get released, like Sumo Digital's exceptional conversions of Konami's GTI Club Rally Côte d'Azur and Sega's Outrun Online Arcade, and Sega's own HD re-release of Daytona USA, just whet my appetite for more, and Scud Race seemed like the perfect game to satisfy that urge. So much so that around this time period, I actually went as far as creating a Facebook group to try and petition Sega to release it. I think the fact it had never had a home conversion of any sort just helped to fuel this sense of mystique that the game had, and made me want to play it even more. While Scud Race itself never received a home port, the tracks in the game did eventually make their way over to a home system in an unlikely place, the original Xbox port of Sega's Outrun 2, where the 4 tracks appeared stitched together like an Outrun 2 course as an unlockable bonus stage, along with the 3 stages from Daytona USA 2. This was very much an Outrun 2 homage to the Scud Race tracks though, rather than a one-to-one conversion, as they were recreations using the Outrun 2 game engine and graphics. Interestingly, as I mentioned in a few videos before this one, the later released Japanese version of Outrun 2 on the Xbox actually had some further graphical tweaks made to it to make these bonus stages more arcade accurate, such as the return of the planes flying overhead in the beginner night stage, and the flaming torches in the advanced stage, and the sailing ship in the beginner day stage, which were missing in the Western game. I'd actually owned Outrun 2 for quite a long time back in the day, without having any knowledge of these bonus tracks being in the game, as I didn't really ever play the mission mode stuff needed to unlock them, and I hadn't looked at any online guides on the game that mentioned that this bonus content was in there, and I'd also moved on to playing Outrun 2006 Coast to Coast by this point. I actually randomly found out about the bonus stages while surfing the internet whilst I was stuck on a night shift at work in my job at the time. I nearly fell off my chair in shock when I realised I could have been playing tracks from Scud Race and Daytona USA 2 in Outrun 2 at home for about the last year and a bit. Suffice it to say that the second I got home from work, despite being absolutely knackered and wanting nothing more than to go to sleep, I had to fire up these bonus stages for the first time and see what they were like. It was around the same sort of time period that I very first started to get into emulation. Initially just simple old 2D games in MAME, but then moving on to more complex 3D stuff like Model 2 emulator. I then realised that the possibility of playing Scud Race at home could become a reality. It was listed as playable in the ancient version of MAME that I was using. The very first time I tried to boot it up on my old Pentium 4, I was greeted with a black screen and I thought that the emulator might have crashed. But I thought, let's just leave this for a little bit and we'll see if something happens. And after about 5 minutes, it did. The game suddenly sprung to life, running at an incredible 1 to 2 frames every second. I was eventually able to get some slightly better performance in the game by taking the side off my PC and blowing a desktop fan directly on the motherboard. Something that you can see me doing here in this ancient video of mine. But in 2011, a new emulator came on the scene specifically for Model 3 games called Supermodel that was developed by a gent called Bart. And the very first time I tried it out, it offered much better performance than MAME on my ancient PC hardware. I eventually upgraded from my single core Pentium 4 to a quad core i5 and was finally able to play Supermodel full speed. At this point, Supermodel was still very much in an early state and only had digital controls and no working sound. Back in those very early days of Supermodel, Bart actually contacted me after seeing a few YouTube videos I'd uploaded of Supermodel version 0.1 to see if I'd like to be a playtester for the not yet public release of Supermodel version 0.2. A significant step up from the original, as it now added in working audio, analog controls and working force feedback if you are using a racing wheel, and I was finally able to get to play Scud Race properly at home and really get my teeth stuck into it. Now, I mentioned earlier that Scud Race was considered by some as a sort of spiritual successor to Daytona USA when it first released, which was how I'd imagined it would play like once I'd got used to it. In truth though, it actually handles very differently to its Model 2 predecessor. Whereas the emphasis in Daytona USA was on using the gears to initiate drifts around the corners, Scud Race was all about initiating the drift at the right angle that allowed you to drift with the best possible acceleration but without going too wide and crashing into the wall, something called an accelo-drift. Basically, you want to come off the accelerator for a split second and brake just before you start turning around the corner, then get back onto the accelerator as you turn into the corner and drift around it. Ah, you're probably thinking, just like the drifting system in Outrun 2. Just like I did. Except, why did my car keep on drifting out too wide and smashing into the wall? Why did it start spinning out every time I tried to correct this? Oh, right, I see. Scud Race handles nothing like Outrun 2. Scud Race is hard. Unlike Outrun 2's slightly on-rails type of drifting, Scud Race is incredibly unforgiving and requires a really fine balance when you're sliding around the corners. Keeping your foot flat out on the gas will generally make you drift too wide. Coming off the gas altogether will make your car spin out. If you try a Daytona USA style 424 gear drift, the car will just instantly spin out. Manual gears are still used if you want to go faster, but the brakes are what you'll be using to drift. There really is a sweet spot where you have to just try and almost pump the gas a bit to try and keep the drift controlled. If you get it just right though, once you're through the main apex of the corner, if you floor the gas whilst the car is still drifting, it will gain an absolute shit ton of speed, which is where the accelo-drift name comes from. It's a rather finicky system that, in all honesty, I have never quite 100% got my head around. There's a saying that's often used when talking about Sega arcade racers: easy to pick up and play, hard to master, and this is very true in Scud Race's case. You can definitely just jump straight into a game and get around the tracks in the time limit within a few goes, but trying to really get a feel for these cars can just take an absolute age. It's just so easy to cock the drifts up. You might have 2 laps of doing it absolutely perfectly, and then as you go into the third, despite seemingly not doing anything different, you somehow manage to spin the car out by not accelerating enough, or you drift too wide and crash. These 2 hairpin bends at the end of the Mystery Ruins advanced stage are a particular nightmare when it comes to this. There are also some small jumps and bits of the track too, like on the beginner day stage, that can also cause disaster, as you might find yourself inadvertently initiating an accelo-drift, when all you were trying to do was just straighten the car out. One thing I have definitely found is necessary if you're using a racing wheel is to make sure that your pedals are properly calibrated to see the full axis of their range of movement. And as I struggled to get my head around Scud Race's weird handling, it began to dawn on me that my infatuation with it had been purely superficial. For all these years I'd admired it for its sheer beauty and art style, rather than how it actually played. And the truth was, once it was fully emulated and I could play it to my heart's content at home, Scud Race actually wasn't as much fun as I thought it was going to be. I mean, don't get me wrong, racing through the beginner day and beginner night stages will always be a blast. But in my head, I'd imagined it as basically a circuit-based arcade racing game that would play something like Outrun 2 or Daytona USA or Sega Rally. But the oh-so-fine balance between absolutely nailing an accelo-drift, or messing it up and slamming into the wall, or spinning out because you lost too much speed or oversteered into the corner, does make it quite hard to really enjoy it sometimes. This is also combined with some absolutely brutally hard rubber banding AI that makes getting the number 1 slots especially hard on the advanced and expert stages. Way more difficult than I ever found getting first place on the expert or advanced stages on Daytona USA. Several years back, I decided to try and have a serious attempt at getting first place on the advanced stage and a half decent time. It took me fucking hours to do, like literally an entire afternoon, with multiple times I was on the verge of just giving up. It stopped being fun real quick, especially after each time a drift would fuck up on the final lap, resulting in an explosive outburst of Tourette's from me directed at the TV. After that experience with it, I must confess that I've never had a serious attempt at trying to get a first place on the game's expert course. Although, weirdly, I think the advanced course actually seems harder. I should probably just point out here as well, this isn't just me being shit at the game. I've seen plenty of posts on arcade, emulation and racing forums back in the day, from people who are equally struggling to get their heads around Scud's handling. I can recall seeing a post from friend of the channel Isamu over on Resetera, describing Scud Race and Daytona USA 2 as being part of Toshihiro Nagoshi's sadistic phase. It's a weird experience, as I'd been so obsessed with being able to play the game at home for such a long time, and then finding the reality of playing it to be slightly disappointing. Interestingly though, Isamu does go through a full 360 degree of loving the game, then hating it, and then a few years later loving it again, after spending some serious time really trying to get down to the brass tacks of the game's handling intricacies. Now, as Scud Race is a game I so strongly associate with those early days of the Model 3 board, and as I've talked a fair bit about Supermodel myself in the video, I decided to get in contact with Bart, the Supermodel developer, to see if he'd like to share some of his thoughts about the game and about Supermodel itself and how it's continued to develop over the years. Let's hear from him now.
It's hard to believe that Scud Race is 28 years old. And for me personally, it's crazier still to think that Supermodel started 21 years ago when I was in college. I first encountered Scud Race in a US magazine called Next Generation. They did a cover story and had some incredible photos that just absolutely blew my mind. I also seem to recall a statement to the effect by Sega that they wanted to achieve film quality graphics by Model 5, which to me was mind-blowing. It's hard to convey to people who didn't grow up in the mid-90s just how fast the pace of innovation in 3D graphics was back then. It was really a magical time to be a gamer. Now, unfortunately, Model 3 games in the wild were very rare, and I played them very infrequently. Scud Race I only saw maybe a couple of times, so I don't have a lot of very strong recollections about the gameplay, but I do remember being blown away by the graphics anytime I saw a Model 3 game. And I think that scarcity and that mystique that sort of built up around these games is what inspired me to work on Supermodel when I got to college. Supermodel is always going to have a special place very near and dear to my heart, and the reason for that is that it launched me on my current career trajectory. You see, back in 2010, I was a graduate student at the University of Washington doing a PhD in electrical engineering, and I was deeply involved in semiconductors and solid-state physics, but realized that that isn't what I wanted to do. In order to pivot, I had to brush up on my programming skills, so I decided to bring back Supermodel, a project I thought would be a lot of fun, see it to completion, and Scud Race was in fact one of the games that I really focused on early on. As many of you may know, in 2011, on April 1st, the initial version of Supermodel was finally released, and since then it's been a pretty wild ride. It's been extremely gratifying to see the community that's built up around it. I'm extremely thankful for all the contributors that have made Supermodel much better than I ever could myself. And you know, I often feel like I have underestimated the size of that community. Sometimes I will look up videos on YouTube of Model 3 games and sort by upload date, and I'm very pleased to see that, you know, month after month people are still playing Supermodel, still making videos of those games. I think it's a testament to just the design chops that Sega had back then to create games that are still fun to this day, and it makes me feel good to know that Supermodel is you know, bringing people enjoyment to this very day, all these years later. One of the interesting moments that I had after leaving Apple in 2021 was one of the designers on their HI team reached out to me and asked if I was the same Bart who developed Supermodel. Turns out that he had built a Daytona 2 arcade cabinet, a racing cabinet that he was using Supermodel to play with. And that's actually one of my favorite categories of videos that I see, are people that put together these like elaborate cabinets and record themselves playing, you know, either solo or with a friend with network play. It just feels really great to know that Supermodel is able to kind of bring those, you know, memories and that experience back to them. And I'm excited to see where it goes over the next, you know, 10 plus years. So thank you to everybody who has, you know, contributed in any way, whether you're a fan or a developer. I really appreciate it. And again, thanks to Sega for making these phenomenal games.
Thanks a lot to Bart there for agreeing to be part of this video. And massive thanks to him and everyone else who's had any input in the development of Supermodel for the work they've done in bringing home not just Scud Race, but a huge quantity of Sega arcade gems that never made it to the home back in the day. So there we go, Scud Race. A game that I had such a big old chubby for such a long time that it just didn't quite match the same level of hype I'd built up for it in my head. And as I've said, don't get me wrong, it is still a great game, but I just don't find it quite as enjoyable as other classic Sega arcade racers like Virtua Racing, Daytona USA, Sega Rally and Outrun 2. I do still really like Scud Race, despite finding the handling a bit frustrating at times, and the rubber banding AI a bit obnoxious. But I mean, obnoxious rubber banding AI was pretty much par for the course back in the 90s. The two beginner stages are great fun, and driving through the Dolphin Tunnel never gets old, and the advanced and expert stages are both fantastic looking tracks, even if those two hairpins at the end of Mystery Ruins make me want to swear at the TV sometimes. And even now, almost 30 years later, the game still looks absolutely incredible. The music in it is great, and the sense of speed is absolutely phenomenal. If you can play with some mates in multiplayer using Supermodel's link-up ability, it's even more enjoyable. If the game were to somehow magically get a modern release, I would not hesitate to pick it up. Daytona USA 2 finally saw a port to modern systems recently, albeit with a name change and a cosmetic tweak to the Dodge Viper safety car, as a minigame in one of the Yakuza games. But in all honesty, I think the chances of that happening with Scud Race are probably next to zero, given that it's based on a now defunct racing series which features a number of licensed vehicles. Unlike Daytona USA 2, Scud Race would require some far more extensive visual changes to get around those pesky licenses. But hey, crazier things have happened. Sega Racing Classics 3, anyone? Anyway, time to wrap things up there. Were you fortunate enough to see Scud Race in the arcade when it very first came out, and be equally blown away by its visuals like me? What do you think of the way it handles and plays? Let me know in the comments. I have been Mr. Thundering, and I will catch you again for another video sometime soon. Cheery ho!